Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, and today in central London, I'm meeting Doug Klain, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine. Hello, Doug.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for finding time in your busy schedule. You just left Ukraine, and today you live in London for DC.
Correct.
Crazy life, busy schedule.
It's busy times, but I'm very glad that we found time for getting to chat today. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, fantastic. Before we start talking, I can't resist to ask about your bright, beautiful socks. And I see the familiar symbols there. What is it?
I don't know if they're in frame, but I got these at the Kiev Ukozalesnitsia, a little pop-up shop that they have. It's so cool that they have these shops now in the train stations in Kiev and Lviv, and you can buy wonderful Ukozalesnitsia goods. And so I got to get plenty of gifts and posters and things for family and friends. And I had to get some Ukozalesnitsia socks for myself.
Are they good?
Oh, I love them. And I love Ukozalesnitsia. Best trains in the world.
Well, at least they deliver you safely.
Yes. The U.S. has a lot to learn from Ukrainian railways. Our trains could stand to be a lot more like Ukraine's trains.
Really?
Yes. Famously, American trains, we could be a lot better with our Amtrak trains. They get delayed all the time, and I always find this so funny. I remember one time, I think it was while Alexander Kamyshin was still the head for the Ukrainian railways, and he had publicly apologized because a missile hit some tracks, a train was delayed, it arrived back in Kiev 10 minutes late, and they were very apologetic about that. Meanwhile, an American Amtrak train can be 3 or 4 hours late, and they're like, well, what are you going to do? We have a lot to learn.
Wow. Let's start with a broad question. What are your thoughts about the global events around Ukraine?
So it is a really critical year for support for Ukraine on the battlefield. 2024, it's not like 2023. Last year, hopes were really high about Ukraine's counteroffensive. And unfortunately, Ukraine's partners did not do enough to set Ukraine's forces up for success in their counteroffensive. And they gave the Russians too much time to dig in, to prepare, and restricted Ukraine from, getting the kinds of tools that they needed to make a difference on the battlefield. And that's been an unfortunate story that we have seen throughout these 2.5 years of invasion, where Ukraine and Ukraine's advocates are very clear. This is what Ukraine needs to win, to make a difference on the battlefield, to break through. And there is hemming and hawing and debate. Should Ukraine get tanks? Should Ukraine get multiple launch rocket systems? Should they get ATACMS missiles? And eventually the answer becomes yes, but too late. And so this year, the Russians have taken advantage of this disastrous delay in American aid. For 8 months, the U.S. did not send the supplemental assistance that Ukraine needed, and the Russians are taking advantage of that. They are trying to get back on the attack. We've seen the offensive against Kharkiv. We're seeing other offensive operations that the Russians are trying to do to take advantage before Ukraine is able to reconstitute, to fully resupply, and ready itself for whatever comes next. This is a year of endurance, I think, on the battlefield, trying to shape the conditions for a potential breakthrough in the future for Ukraine. But in the meantime, Ukraine and its partners are trying to be quite active on the diplomatic sphere. As you mentioned, there's been quite a lot of developments. The progress on the transfer of Russian state assets. We've had positive news on that, but there is still a lot of ways to go on it. We are finally getting more assistance to Ukraine. We're having meaningful policy changes, like allowing U.S. supplied weapons to be used by Ukraine in Russian territory. Not all. And I think that that's a very important thing to remember, and it's a change that needs to happen. But we are making progress on these things. But the big question is, how long is it going to take to get Ukraine what it really needs to make a difference?
The positive thing that are happening, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Ukraine finally has got military aid, and I know that you and your work put a lot of effort to make it happen. Could you talk me through?
Sure. So if it would help, maybe I can introduce what Razom for Ukraine is.
Sure.
Razom started a decade ago by Ukrainian Americans in New York City who saw my Maidan, who saw the revolution of dignity and said, this is a new opportunity for Ukraine and Ukraine's future. We have to help. And then, of course, with the Russian invasion then, the main priority at first for Razom was sending medical assistance, humanitarian aid to help Ukrainians. And it was an excellent, scrappy, nonprofit organization in the U.S. It had a budget of maybe a couple $100,000 every year. And then in 2022, with the full-scale invasion, Razom was positioned really to be one of these go-to places where if you're an American and you want to donate to help Ukraine, Razom was one of these places that you could do it and be confident that it would make a difference. I'm sure you remember in the early days of the full-scale invasion, a lot of these pillars of humanitarian aid, when people want to help in times of crisis, they donate to these organizations, and a lot of these big ones drop the ball. They didn't know how to operate in Ukraine. They didn't know how to really help and get aid into the country. Razom did. And so the budget went from a couple $100,000 to over $100 million. And the vast majority of that still goes to direct assistance in Ukraine. One of these great things that we've just started is a new program supported by the Howard Buffett Foundation, training Ukozaleznytsia attendants in first aid and in how to care for people, for passengers in times of crisis. I'm part of our advocacy team because, like I mentioned, Razom changed quite a lot in 2022. And one of these things is Razom decided, while the bulk of our work is still getting direct aid into Ukraine, we need to make sure that the United States continues to aid Ukraine. And so I'm part of an advocacy team that works in Washington, D.C., and it is good, old-school American advocacy in Washington. We have a government affairs team that advocates directly to Congress, to the executive branch, and we have a public engagement team that advocates to everybody else in America and tries to make the case that support for Ukraine's victory, it's not just the right thing to do, but it's in our interests as Americans. And so we just spent about 8 months in Washington fighting quite hard for the passage of this supplemental aid bill through Congress. And it was probably the most challenging period for our advocacy team. You know, the first year and a half, I would say, of the full-scale invasion, support for Ukraine was really a given in Congress. When there was a request for aid, when something had to happen, Congress made it happen. It was not a debate. And this delay over the supplemental, that was the first time that really they said no, and they blocked it, and we felt consequences over it.
But why?
That's a really great question. Unfortunately, because of politics, because there was this narrative that support for Ukraine in the U.S. was declining, it was becoming partisan, and that if you're a Republican member of Congress and you vote to support Ukraine, you're putting America last and Ukraine first. That's this narrative that was going around. It was fueled in part by Russian propaganda, but it was also fueled by domestic partisans who wanted political gains. And a really important lesson here on the other side of the supplemental being passed was that narrative was false. I'll explain, in the U.S. we have something called primary elections, where before the big election in November, throughout the year, there will be smaller elections in districts for members of Congress where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party decide who will their candidate be. So Democrats running against Democrats to be the Democratic candidate and vice versa. And in these primaries, the people, we have very low voter turnout in the U.S., and the people that turn out for these elections are some of the most extreme partisans that you have in both parties. They are diehards for their cause. And that means that in these elections, the candidates tend to be more extreme, try to play to the base, not to the general public. And for these Republicans, that meant that they were really afraid that they would be accused of putting America last and Ukraine first, and that they could lose their primary election and lose it to somebody who was more extreme. And so they were afraid of supporting Ukraine. Now, every Republican who voted yes for the supplemental aid bill that passed in April, they have all won their primary elections so far. There are still more to go, but so far 100% of them survived and won. And that is a very important thing that we want to remind them of. Support for Ukraine is not a political albatross hanging around your neck. It's not a risk. It's an asset. It's okay to support Ukraine. You will keep your seat in Congress if you do that.
Yeah, but how did you work to communicate to Speaker Johnson that he needs to make the right decision?
Yeah, so this was another one of these twists and turns throughout the 8 months. Maybe you'll remember the U.S. Senate did pass supplemental aid for Ukraine, and it passed it in a bipartisan fashion with 70 plus members of the Senate voting for it, and then they sent it to the House. And the way that our House of Representatives works is normally the Speaker of the House chooses, all right, we have a bill that was sent to us by the Senate. I will bring it to the floor of the House and we will all vote on it. And I will choose that we vote on it. He has a lot of power on how things are run. And he had these same fears that he could lose his job if he brought Ukraine aid to the floor. You might remember that last fall, the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, he was ousted by extreme Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are in fact anti-Ukraine. And that was a historic thing that had never happened in the history of Congress before. And it was shocking. And Mike Johnson was afraid that if he brought Ukraine aid to the floor, the same thing would happen to him. He would be ousted as Speaker and his party would be in chaos. And so what we had to do was convince him that first, it's in your interests to bring Ukraine aid to the floor. It's the right thing to do to pass aid to Ukraine, but also you will not lose your job if you do it. It will be politically okay. And there were a lot of organizations that were working on this. I do not want to say that Razom was the only one doing this, but we spent all of our time doing it. And so one of the really interesting things I would say that we did a lot of work in his home state of Louisiana. Speaker Mike Johnson is from Louisiana, and I can tell you a story, and it involves basketball and the Bible. In Louisiana, that is Speaker of the House Mike Johnson's home state, and the role of constituent pressure in U.S. politics is really important. And so we did two things in Louisiana to try to show that bringing Ukraine aid to the floor of the House for a vote was not just the right thing to do, but also he would be safe. His seat would be safe. He would not lose his speakership. So we did two things. It involves basketball and the Bible. And in the 1990s, I'll go back and start there. Perhaps you're familiar with Shaquille O'Neal, a famous NBA basketball player. He used to play at Louisiana State University, and Louisiana State University is like everybody loves the LSU basketball team in Louisiana. That is one of the most important things. And when Shaquille O'Neal left the LSU basketball team to go play for the National Basketball Association, for the NBA, a Ukrainian guy named Roman Rybchenko came and took his place on the LSU basketball team. And he played in Louisiana, and we found this guy and we said, hey, you know why this matters. You can actually go into these communities and be credible, be somebody with a connection to people in Louisiana, and you can make the case and you can explain why, like, hey, guys, you can trust me. Support for Ukraine matters. It's in America's interest. It's the right thing to do. And so we brought Mr. Rybchenko to Louisiana, and he did basketball clinics. He was in gyms, doing basketball with kids. We took him on talk shows on radio. He's walking around meeting local officials, and he is going and talking to Mike Johnson's constituents and saying, guys, tell Mike Johnson, like, we need to pass Ukraine aid. And it was a really interesting example of, like, we as people from Washington, D.C., we can't just assume we can walk into somebody's community and say, you should vote for Ukraine, you should support Ukraine. We don't, we're outsiders. And this was somebody who was an insider, who was part of the community and could really talk to them. the other thing, so that was the basketball portion of this. The other portion was the Bible. When Speaker of the House Mike Johnson became the Speaker, it was a really unique time in American politics because he was a total unknown player. He was a backbencher. He had not been in Congress for a very long time. People did not know really who he was. And all of a sudden, he is third in line for the presidency. He becomes one of the most powerful people in the United States overnight. And there was an interview, I remember, where reporters asked him, Speaker Johnson, what's your worldview? How are you going to make decisions as Speaker? And he said, you want to know my worldview? Open the Bible. That's my worldview. He is a devout evangelical Christian. His faith is very personal and very serious. And we said, okay, let's understand what he thinks. And we found out what his favorite Bible verse is Esther 4:14, which I don't know if you know your Bible verses or not, but it's this story which essentially is about Esther, who is married to the king, and he is going to punish or kill all of the Jews, and the rabbi comes to her and says, Esther, you have to tell him, don't do this. And she says, but he might kill me. I might face consequences for it. And she's told, you were made for such a time as this, to do the right thing even when it might cost you. That is Mike Johnson's favorite verse, to do the right thing even when you might pay a price for it. Come on.
Yeah, that's exactly what we had, didn't we? To do the right thing, to support Ukraine.
And so we put up a billboard across the street from his church, and it said, Speaker Johnson, for such a time as this. And it's right next to an image of a destroyed church in Berdyansk that was destroyed by a Russian missile. And when approaching this angle of appealing through religion to people in the United States, it's a really personal, a really sensitive, and a serious thing. And we want to get it right when we're making that argument. And we did this to show, Speaker Johnson, this war, it's not something that's happening to those people over there. It's happening to all of us. This matters. This affects us. This affects Christians, for example. We did a lot of work to try to educate people, including Speaker Johnson and other Republicans, about how the Russians persecute Christians in the occupied territories. Horrific stories of an evangelical pastor in Luhansk who was being tortured, electrocuted by the FSB, and while he's being tortured, a Russian Orthodox priest comes in and performs an exorcism on him to cast the demons out because he's an evangelical, because he's part of the American faith, and maybe he's an American spy because he's an evangelical.
Of course.
I mean, this is what they do and how they think, because, for the Russians, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is an arm of the Kremlin, so maybe with Protestants, that's the American religion. It's this warped worldview. But when you tell Americans, when you tell evangelicals, when you tell people about this, all of a sudden they see support for Ukraine in a new way. And so that's a really important aspect, I think, of trying to show, a group in the United States, evangelicals, self-identified MAGA voters, that statistically they are the least likely to support aid for Ukraine. But we found in polling that when you tell them these facts, when you make this case, they are more likely than the average American voter to support aid for Ukraine. And it's a remarkable thing. And so that's what we were trying to do with Speaker Johnson. And it did turn out that, when we talked to his office eventually, they said, hold on, Razom, are you guys the billboard people? And we put our logo on it. We wanted to be very clear about, hey, we're making a case here. And so there were a lot of reasons why Speaker Johnson eventually changed his mind. And a lot of people worked to try to convince him and make this case. But I think that this kind of advocacy, showing that it's personal, it's something that does matter for him personally. I think that was a really indispensable thing.
Well, I don't think that anybody could resist that, because you're really taking very personal and very meaningful thing for him. Wow. You mentioned this, the Russian narratives were picked up by politicians, by some of the white public, general public in the US. How strong is Russian propaganda in the US? And is there any changes since the 2014, 2022, and now? Because I can see big changes in the UK among the media professionals, among the journalists, how it was in 2014 and how it was in 2022.
Yeah. So it's a really big question of how deeply has Russian propaganda penetrated American society. We hear Russian narratives all the time. We hear them from elites. We've just really finished up this process of the Republican presidential primaries, selecting who will be the Republican presidential candidate, and it was obvious who it was going to be. But during the primary process, we heard from other Republicans that were trying to be the nominee for president, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who, a big businessman who tried to be like a mini Trump. And he was somebody especially who, on the debate stage, to a national audience, he is spouting off Russian propaganda, Russian conspiracy theories, saying that, President Volodymyr Zelensky is a Nazi, saying that he's corrupt, saying that that Ukrainian society is persecutes Christians. All of these Russian propaganda talking points were being mainstreamed to an American audience. Now, it's a really interesting thing that some of these things can penetrate and can start to convince people, but people are also really open to being convinced of the opposite, being convinced that Ukraine, the reality that Ukraine is a democracy, that we need to support Ukraine to help it win and defeat the Russian invasion. And I think that the bottom line for it is that Americans are really open to being persuaded. And whoever is trying to make the case to them, they will listen to that person. And so it matters who tries to make the case. If you just have people that are repeating Russian talking points, then you're going to have a lot of people that are starting to believe that. But if you have, the opposite of that, and I think that that's something we really need. We need to have American leaders being more public about the need to support Ukraine, about how it's in the interest of the United States, in the interest of Americans. It does have an effect on our everyday life. I would love it for President Biden to be more vocal about this, of making the case. I would love it for more Republicans to be more vocal about it, because there are many pro-Ukraine Republicans. And we saw that in Congress. We saw that in the votes for the supplemental aid. And they all really need to make this case, because if they aren't trying to convince the American people, others are.
Why they don't do it, in your opinion?
I think that we're still in this spot where, we're in an election year in the United States, and they're very sensitive to, what will get people to vote for them as politicians. I'll take President Biden for an example. We saw earlier this year, he was trying out different advertisements and different messages for his presidential campaign. He did ads about his support for Ukraine, trumpeting it, showing the footage from when he was in Kyiv, and air raid sirens were going off as he's walking around with President Zelensky. And that was a really interesting thing to see President Biden saying, this might be a political asset for me. I'm going to campaign on it. But now, as of a couple of months ago, there was an interesting story in Politico, I want to say it was in May, that the Biden campaign no longer really saw support for Ukraine as an issue to make a big deal about in the campaign. They didn't see it as something that would win them votes. They see domestic issues in the U.S. as more important to make the case. They prioritize making the case about democracy, especially with regards to Trump, making the case about what Biden has done to help the economy recover from the crash with coronavirus and to get inflation under control. These are issues that he sees as more politically advantageous. I don't know if that's the right calculation. Maybe it is, but I have to think that support for a democracy, surviving a genocide by a tyrannical power trying to control it, that is something that Americans can and should take pride in for helping Ukraine. And that's a message that I think they do need to hear. One other aspect with it that I think is probably in their decision making is we're actually in a very unique spot right now where Ukraine is not a deeply polarized partisan issue in the United States. And if Biden were to start really campaigning and saying like, hey, I'm the pro-Ukraine guy, Trump is the anti-Ukraine guy, then all of a sudden you've turned support for Ukraine into a Democratic issue and a Republican issue. And that's something that could be really harmful for support for Ukraine by making it partisan like that. And, if that is in their calculus, I can understand that. And it's been really noticeable that, Trump up to now has not come out as virulently anti-Ukraine, as saying, we need to coerce the Ukrainians into giving up territory for the Russians and end this war. He has not come out and said that plainly yet. There are advisors who say that's maybe what he wants, but he does not see being anti-Ukraine as a winning campaign issue, I think. And this is really, really important.
Yeah, but he says that he will finish war in 24 hours or 48 hours. So how we can interpret that?
Yeah, I think back to remarks that he had made during one of his rallies, and it was interesting because the reaction in Ukraine to these remarks were really very interesting. He had made these remarks saying, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine under my watch. Putin invaded Ukraine because Biden is so weak. I would have been so strong for Ukraine that Putin never would have done it. And a lot of people took this as like, whoa, Trump is making like really pro-Ukraine remarks. He like really supports Ukraine. And it was really more of an anti-Biden remark more than anything else. It was just him saying, I think Biden is weak, and it never would have happened under my watch. And he makes these remarks all the time, and he says lots of things that are really just about saying, he's great. He can do anything. He's the guy who can fix any problem. And it's less, I think, about specific concrete policy proposals. There are things that Trump holds as tightly held views that he really can't be moved on. I think like immigration is one of these things where we know what his immigration policies are. You cannot convince him to, let dreamers, which are people who were brought as children to the United States, without authorization, letting these people stay in the country. We know that he would not allow something like that to happen. He can't be convinced. On Ukraine, I think it's a question of, how deeply held are his views about Ukraine? How open to being convinced is he? Is this an issue where the last person that he talked to, can really shape his views on it? And so that's something that I think is really quite important of people who can try to make the case to him on what Ukraine policy should be.
Do you think he already overcome that bitterness with experience he had on the phone call with President Zelensky, and it led to his first impeachment, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And look, I can't see inside of Donald Trump's mind. If I could, I would be a very rich man. But I'm not, because I can't. So, it's always been kind of a mixed thing on that. He had said things after the perfect phone call of, he had said remarks to the extent of like, Zelensky was a good guy. He didn't play into the Democrats' Russia hoax on all of this, and, saying like Zelensky just stayed out of it, rightly so, not getting involved in American domestic politics. I think it's a really good question of when Trump thinks about Ukraine today, what Ukraine does he see? Because I think that he deals with his foreign affairs on a very personal basis. It's about who is the world leader that he deals with, and it's about that direct relationship. And which Zelensky does he see when he looks at Ukraine today? Does he see Zelensky from 2019, or does he see wartime Zelensky, who maybe is somebody that could even appeal to Trump in a way, a tough guy with a tough guy image? It's a really good question of when Trump thinks of Ukraine, when he thinks of Zelensky, which one does he think of? The one from then or now?
So Ukraine has a lot of if, but how Europe can get ready for Trump's presidency if he gets the post?
Yeah. So I've written about it for Foreign Policy magazine. I wrote an article for them in January, I think, making the argument that, look, during the last Trump administration, we saw what his policy towards Europe was, and it was outright hostile at times. He waged a trade war against American allies in Europe. He undermined the deterrent effect of Article 5 by suggesting, hey, maybe we won't come to the aid of some of our allies. And Europe knows this, and I think Europe has woken up to that reality this year, and they have time, European governments have time to prepare and make sure that if Trump becomes president again next January, the rug can't be pulled out from under European security. And I think that really comes down to, first, building a lot, not being so reliant on the United States for security assistance, spinning up factories, making lots of artillery shells, and being able to support Ukraine and support Ukraine's needs from a security assistance perspective. Up to now, we have seen a real imbalance between when it comes to aiding Ukraine, Europe has done less in terms of military and security assistance, and the U.S. has really shouldered a lot of the security assistance aspect. But Europe, that is to say nothing of immense amounts that Europe has done to support Ukraine, which the United States has not done. Europe has shouldered the economic and humanitarian burden immensely. But when it comes to security, I think that that's something that it's in Europe's interest to take more ownership for it, to not be as reliant. It also is good for the NATO alliance generally if there is something of a serious European pillar that can stand more on its own in complement to NATO, that it isn't so reliant on the U.S. and the whims of an American president who has not shown profound commitment to America's allies.
Do you think there's going to be any changes towards Ukraine if Biden stays?
I hope that if Biden wins the presidential election and stays in power, it will be legacy time. It's his second and last term. He's not a young guy, and he has to think a lot about what kind of a legacy am I leaving. Ukraine, I think, is the most important thing that he could do, and helping Ukraine win would be one of the most important things. We talked a lot about these domestic political calculuses that he probably has right now with support for Ukraine, and I hope that he would be emboldened if he wins in November. I hope that the Biden we would see in a second term is more like the Biden we saw just after the full-scale invasion in 2022, when he gave a speech in Poland, and he went off script and said his mind, and he said, for God's sake, this man Putin cannot stay in power. And of course, he had aides who were walking it back and saying, no, the United States is not advocating regime change. No, that's not what he's talking about. Like, yes, of course. But that, I hope, is where Biden really sits personally on support for Ukraine. Like, Ukraine has to win, and we have to do whatever it takes to help them win, to ensure that Russia's invasion fails. That is the Biden that I hope we see.
Well, he will need to be careful. He will need to be very careful with his statements and his communication with the electorate, because it's going to be second term, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would like to know, how about the war propagandists and American attitude within organizations and general public towards them? Because recently the legal director of Klain Foundation said the organization was seeking the arrest and extradition of the most obvious Russian propagandists in Europe to face charges of war propaganda. And I think it's one of the sort of strongest statements about the harm of war propaganda. And obviously it sparked outrage among Russian officials like former President Dmitry Medvedev. Then George Clooney issued a statement that someone in the foundation misspoke. Is the issue in America in terms of war propaganda and its harmful work and its damages for people's minds, and which ending up with war missiles and destructed lives?
Yeah. I mean, this has always been a really fascinating issue in the U.S. context because we are, I think, more radical in our protection of speech than a lot of European countries can be at times. The UK, for instance, has different protections for speech than the U.S. has. And in the U.S., look, people can say what they want. There are very few abilities for the government to censor and restrict speech or expression or media and publications. And so the ways that we have to counter mis and disinformation are different. And I think that we have to rely much more on positive messages of pushing back and saying, look, the Russian propagandists are saying what they are. They are trying to paint a totally false picture of Ukraine. We have to paint the real picture of Ukraine and educate our own people on the reality. The Russians say that Ukraine persecutes Christians. The reality is the Russians persecute Christians, and they are projecting this falsehood onto Ukraine, which is a pluralistic, democratic society. The president is Jewish. His defense minister is Muslim. His foreign secretary is Christian. That's an image that is more like America than many other places. And that's an image that I think is really powerful to share with Americans that counters false Russian narratives. At the same time, I think that people are waking up to this reality that Russia is not a normal country. And you talked about this evolution from 2014, 2022 to today in 2024. And the way that Russian propagandists talk about the world is not normal. They talk about nuking American cities. They fantasize about destroying our countries. They say that they're at war with us. They fantasize about abducting tens of thousands of Ukrainian children, one of the most horrific war crimes in this war.
To kill Ukrainian children.
Yes. And I think that people are understanding that this reality. And when they hear Russian messages, when they hear messages from Russian propagandists, this reality, I think, is sticking in their minds more. And we are seeing it in polling, too. Vladimir Putin is deeply, deeply reviled by Americans across the political spectrum. He has, the lowest favorability ratings of any world leader, which, I get it. Americans of all stripes want Ukraine to win and do not want Russia to win. Even MAGA Republicans, there was a fascinating poll that came out, I think, this week from the Ronald Reagan Institute, and they polled what are the foreign policy preferences of Republicans, especially self-identified MAGA Republicans. And they found that, even for these MAGA Republicans, they still wanted Ukraine to win. They still want Russia to lose. And at times, depending on how you frame the question or if you're making the argument to them, like we talked about before, they might support it more than the average Republican, more than a mainstream Republican, which is a fascinating result.
Yes, but there's one thing to want, and there's another thing to have it as strategic interest or to treat it as one of the interests, because we just mentioned the President Biden, he makes some powerful statement and then goes back, or says some statement and looking weak. And reading numerous articles for the campaign, I understand there is a caution in the White House for him not to look so weak. So he tries to look powerful. Is it his personality, or it's more sort of this political game?
In terms of Biden, like how he's viewed publicly? In
terms of his statements and how he viewed, and is in overall, because there is thought that Biden is terrified of nuclear war because of his age, and he grew through the Cold War. So these kind of things, and knowing Putin, how he likes to blackmail and press on people's weaknesses, it can be the game for him.
Yeah, this has been, I think, one of the shortcomings in the Biden administration's policy towards Ukraine. This religion almost about escalation, and that has overshadowed every decision. And when figuring out the best way to support Ukraine, you cannot ignore nuclear war as a risk. You cannot ignore risks of Russian escalation. But there has to be a calculus and a ratio of, how much can we do to support Ukraine while minimizing the risks that the Russians could try to kill, Americans, or try to attack NATO territory, or try to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. How can you do the maximum thing possible while minimizing these risks? And I think they've got that ratio wrong. They're not doing enough to support Ukraine, and actually by doing that, they're even increasing the risks of Russian escalation by showing the Russians that you can push us around, you can bully us into being afraid of you by just saying nuclear war, and then we'll cower in fear. And so I think that they've got the ratio off. There is obviously so much more that can be done to support Ukraine, while showing the Russians that if they try to escalate, they will face profound consequences. When they were, really threatening nuclear use, and I think this was in the fall of 2022, and that's when the risk of it, to my understanding from public reporting, it was really high, and there was a legitimate risk that the Russians might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And what did the Biden administration do? It didn't say, okay, we'll stop supporting Ukraine now. Jake Sullivan went on TV and said, if the Russians do this, they will face catastrophic consequences. And he left it vague, but I think the understanding was, if the Russians use nuclear weapons, the United States would do something to make sure that they can't do that again. And that is much more of an appropriate way of dealing with these Russian threats of nuclear war, which are designed to bully us into submission. The answer to that isn't backing down. It's showing that they will be unsuccessful if they try.
We're heading towards a NATO summit in DC, and it's going to be 75th anniversary of the alliance. And expected lots of powerful statements, some maybe offers, invitations, propositions. Last year in Vilnius, there was quite disappointing for Ukraine. The expectations were very high. This year, both sides, American and Ukrainian, very careful expressing themselves. What we should expect for Ukraine from this summit?
So, unfortunately, I don't think that Ukraine is going to be invited to join NATO at this summit, and that's really been the consensus in Washington, and I think in other capitals. People understand that going into this. I think that that's the wrong move. I think that Ukraine should receive an official invitation, and that the roadmap of these are the reforms that Ukraine needs to make to join, showing that, hey, there is a path to getting to NATO, rather than this vague promise of, Ukraine can join when allies agree and conditions are met. You have to show Ukraine that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that they're not going to be stuck in the waiting room indefinitely. And I hope that in Washington at the NATO summit, we start to see more of a concrete outlining of this is what it will take for Ukraine to come in. These are the reforms to make to the military, to civilian control of the military, to NATO standards, to anti-corruption and democratic reforms. Give the roadmap. That's what I want to see. I'm hopeful that there will be progress and that we will get more than we saw at Vilnius. But what I think the most realistic thing is that Ukraine should walk away from the NATO summit with tangible support, not just political support, but coming back with air defenses, coming back with policy changes, allowing U.S. weapons to be used on any legitimate Russian target, regardless of how near to Kharkiv it is. That, I think, is what is going to be prioritized, and especially if allies understand that there isn't going to be a lot of progress on the political front for NATO membership for Ukraine, I think that the pressure to deliver on the military assistance front will be much greater. And I know that for Ukrainian officials, that is a priority going into this summit, especially when it comes to air defenses.
Well, yeah, it's vital for Ukraine. We understand why Ukraine would like to join NATO, because the conflict with Russia won't be finished after the war actually finished, because it's been for 100 years. Russia has been imperialistic, and every possible opportunity Russia will strike again. My question is, why does NATO need Ukraine, or would be interested for NATO to have Ukraine within the members?
That's a great question, and I wish people asked that question more often. When we talk about Ukraine in NATO, so often the conversation is about what it would do for Ukraine, and it would do a lot for Ukraine. It is the right thing. But Ukraine being an ally in NATO would be transformative for the alliance. Ukraine is the most experienced military in Europe. It is very capable, and the value that Ukraine would bring to the alliance as a member of NATO would be immense. United States military officials and soldiers and trainers are learning a lot from Ukrainians. European and other NATO allied militaries are learning a lot from Ukraine's ingenuity in this war. Ukraine is defining what modern warfare can look like and innovating in incredible ways, especially when it comes to unmanned systems. These are lessons that the United States and NATO can draw, and having Ukraine part of the alliance would only help with that. Also, when you think about, U.S. priorities, both Biden and Trump have wanted to pivot security-wise away from Europe and towards China, towards the Indo-Pacific region. That's where they have wanted to focus U.S. military forces, and where they see greater threats and needs. And if you've got a Russia that is trying to invade and conquer Europe, having one of the most capable militaries in the world as part of the NATO alliance, the pressure starts to get off from U.S. military forces. Europe becomes more capable with Ukraine firmly as part of it. Ukraine brings immense value to the alliance, and I think that that's a conversation we need to have much more often.
How about this agreement that Ukraine recently signed with the U.S., this security agreement? How important is that, and what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so I think about it in two ways. First, it is remarkable that this document, that this bilateral security agreement exists. If 5 years ago you were to say that the United States would sign a 10-year agreement with Ukraine that really outlines this statement of principles saying, in effect, the United States will help transform Ukraine's military into one of the best militaries in the world. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and it would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. And so I think the value of that cannot be understated. At the same time, this is not a document that pledges, we are going to send 50 F-16s and, 50,000 rounds of 155 artillery ammunition every month. It's not a specific thing in that respect of the aid that the U.S. is going to give Ukraine. The document basically says the U.S. wants to do this stuff for Ukraine, And now it's on Congress to pass legislation that makes that happen. It kind of punts it in that way. This is not a binding treaty that would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. This is not a security guarantee like Article 5 saying that if Ukraine is attacked in the future, the United States will come to Ukraine's aid. It says if Russia attacks Ukraine, then the United States and Ukraine will consult and very quickly figure out the necessary response. And this is on the scale between, the Budapest Memorandum, which failed very clearly, and that the U.S. did not uphold, that other allies did not uphold, really, and meet the obligations of it. Between something that is so non-binding like that and something that is much more ironclad, like NATO Article 5, this sits somewhere more in the middle. I mean, it's not Budapest, but it is very far from an Article 5 agreement. There is a lot of work to be done, but when we think about ways that we're, in the United States, we're trying to, I think, institutionalize support for Ukraine to make it this lasting, real thing that is hard to disrupt, that can exist beyond administrations, can live on beyond Biden's terms as president. An agreement like this is still an important step. We're forging these closer ties. We are getting more things written down saying the United States will help Ukraine, and that is unambiguously a good thing. But people should hold no illusions about this is not a security guarantee.
What we are going to expect during the next, let's say, till summer 2025, in terms of relationship between Ukraine and US? So is there some sort of continuation on diplomatic circles, maybe some agreements, declaration of support, or there's something and kind of another new work we need to prepare yourself?
So actually there is one big thing that I think is worth raising, and it's been flying under the radar. The Biden administration needs to submit to Congress a strategy for victory in Ukraine. And this was something that was added on in the supplemental aid bill. When the supplemental passed the Senate, and then in the House, they made some changes, and then they passed that. This was one of these changes, and it came from Republicans, actually, saying, we want the Biden administration, 45 days from the passage of this supplemental aid bill, to submit a detailed strategy to Congress that should be declassified, anybody can see it, saying, this is what it will take for Ukraine to win. These are the weapons that we haven't sent Ukraine that we could send that would make a difference. This is what China and Iran and North Korea are doing to support Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. This is what the costs would be to the United States in its interests if Russia won in Ukraine. It's very detailed in what it asks for. Now, the Biden administration blew past the deadline. It was supposed to be 45 days, which would have been on June 8. That didn't happen. Maybe one of the reasons why was because they were in the final stages of finalizing the bilateral security agreement, and maybe that was taking more focus. But also, everybody kind of knew already that they were not going to meet that deadline, and I think people understood that already in Washington. But what that does create an opportunity for is to make recommendations and to say, like, hey, if bring together American military experts and diplomatic experts to really say, like, all right, what should be in that strategy? What should the Biden administration put forward as this strategy for victory? And if they put together a strategy and submit this document, and it is a serious document, a serious strategy for how to make a difference in Ukraine, for how to help Ukrainians win, I think that would be a really crucial development. And it's something that, from an advocacy perspective, the Biden administration has said this is what it would take to win. You can hold them to that. And if Donald Trump wins in November, this is something that he can be held to as well. If he deviated from it in any way, that's a headline that comes out immediately. Trump deviates from victory strategy for Ukraine, and the political costs of not supporting Ukrainian victory, of not following that strategy, would be raised, would make it more difficult for him to deviate from that. In the same way that I talked about with the bilateral security agreement of being an important thing of we're having more documents, more strategies, more legislation out there about how the U.S. can support Ukraine's victory. This strategy, I think, could be a really important thing, but only if the Biden administration gets it right.
Do you think they're mentally there? Because one thing is document is declaration of something which already happened in the heads of people who are in charge. From DC, do you sense it? Have they mentally prepared? I'm asking it because talking to Ukrainians on this podcast and privately, and there's a thought that Americans do give just a bit to keep Ukraine defend itself, but not to win, because American political establishment not prepared for Russia to lose because they don't know what to expect. Is it going to be a disruption in Europe initiated by Putin? Is it going to be pressing the button of the nuclear bomb? What to expect from Putin? And they had a very disappointing example with Iraq when they got rid of Hussein, and then what? Having a problem for years and years and years. So, coming back to my question, do you think the White House is mentally prepared for this declaration, for understanding what does it take for the U.S. to help Ukraine to win?
So this has been, I think, a constant evolution and internal debate in the Biden White House. They've gotten so much flack and criticism for this mantra of we are with Ukraine as long as it takes, instead of as long as it takes to win, which is hopefully very soon, whatever it takes instead of as long as it takes. And there are plenty of officials in the Biden administration who do say we have to help Ukraine win. But there's a reason why whenever they say it, it jumps out. And it's like, wow, they said it finally. And it's because that has not felt like the real policy, and it has not been expressed at the highest levels. Coming back again to this bilateral security agreement, that does say in plain English, the United States will help Ukraine win. And that is important, and it jumps out. And so I think that this is one of those things that they are evolving on and getting more comfortable with, but it's taking, of course, far, far too long. And they should have been okay with it on day one, and they should have worked to support it on day one. I think a lot about the historian Timothy Snyder on this, who has done a lot of incredible work of trying to remind people you don't need to be afraid of Russia losing. He makes two great arguments here. One, Russia has lost a lot in the past, and the world has not ended. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War. Russia lost World War I. Russia lost in Afghanistan. And there have been profound political developments inside of Russia. But as American policymakers, there's not a lot that the United States really can do to influence politics inside of Russia. It's up to Russians what kind of country they want to be, and they have to make that choice. We can't make that choice for them, but a choice we can make is to help Ukraine win. That's something that is in our power to make a difference on. And there's another great thing that Snyder says about how did we actually get to peace in Europe? It wasn't just because after World War II, everybody was like, we can never do that again. Let's have the EU and be okay. A big part of why these colonial empires started to change their policies was because they lost colonial wars. France, Spain, the Dutch, after losing a war of colonialism, that's something that can force a profound reckoning inside of a society. And when we think about what will it take for Russians to make this choice to be a normal country and not what it is now, there's not a lot of things that can force a society-wide reckoning, but a profound defeat, that's something that can force a society-wide reckoning. Russia being defeated in Ukraine is the best hope, not only for Ukraine and global peace, but also for the Russians to have a chance at choosing a better future for themselves. And so for all of these reasons, we shouldn't be afraid of Russia losing. In fact, we should encourage it. We should do everything we can to help Ukraine make that a reality. That's something that is in our power to make happen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for finding time. I feel so lucky that I caught you between Kyiv and DC here in London. So I just remind you that today I talked to Klain, non-resident fellow Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for having me.